Rank 1. Emperor and Empress. At the very top of the royal pyramid sits the emperor, a ruler above kings and queens, commanding not just one kingdom, but entire empires. The title comes from Rome, where imperator was first given to victorious generals before morphing into the ultimate symbol of global power. An emperor wasn't just a king, he was the one who ruled kings. But here's the part they never tell you. Empires weren't built on glory, they were built on lies. Roman emperors staged miracle victories by rewriting history books, crowning themselves gods while poisoning rivals at lavish feasts. Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, snatching the crown out of the Pope's hands mid-ceremony, just to prove that no man, not even the church, was above him. Emperors always pretended to be divine, but in reality, they were the most paranoid men alive, obsessed with betrayal inside their own palaces. The throne of the emperor wasn't a crown of gold, it was a crown built to collapse, and yet, below them were kings and queens who dreamed of becoming emperors themselves, but those dreams came at a deadly cost. Rank 2. Kings and Queens. A king or queen rules a single kingdom, sovereign over one defined land, unlike an emperor who rules multiple. The word king comes from old Germanic roots meaning leader of the people, while queen stems from the word for woman or wife. But don't let the simplicity fool you. This was no family title. Kings and queens were the living embodiment of law, land, and loyalty. But here's what they never admit. Kings and queens were often just puppets in crowns. Behind them, webs of advisors, nobles, and clergy pulling the strings. Think of England's King Henry VI, technically the most powerful man in the country, but so unstable he couldn't rule without others making every decision. Or France's Marie Antoinette, the queen remembered for "let them eat cake," a line she likely never said, but one that was weaponized to destroy her reputation and justify her downfall. And here's the darkest twist. Royal marriages weren't love stories, they were political chess moves. Queens were pawns traded for alliances, and kings were quietly removed the moment they showed weakness. To be king or queen was to live in constant fear, because every courtier smiling at you might be plotting your end. And when kings and queens needed to expand their reach, they often turned to a strange, in-between rank, a title designed for rulers who were powerful but not quite royal enough. Rank 3. Archduke and Archduchess. An archduke or archduchess sits above a duke but below a king. The title became most famous in the Austrian Habsburg dynasty, where archdukes controlled massive lands but still technically served under the emperor. It was a way of saying, I'm not just a duke, I'm something greater. But here's the scandal. Archdukes lived in a world of dangerous illusion. They were powerful enough to threaten kings, but never powerful enough to replace them. And that tension turned deadly. The most famous? Archduke Franz Ferdinand. His sudden removal in Sarajevo in 1914 didn't just take down one man, it triggered World War I, the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen at that time. And the whispers around his end? That it wasn't just Serbian rebels. Some claimed European powers quietly looked the other way, even encouraged it, because Franz Ferdinand's politics threatened to shift the balance of the entire continent. In other words, an archduke's crown was less a symbol of power and more a bullseye painted on their head. And if archdukes carried targets, the next rank carried ambition. Men who weren't kings, but wanted everyone to believe they were just one step away. Rank 4. Grand Duke and Grand Duchess. A Grand Duke outranks a normal duke, but doesn't quite reach king status. They ruled over Grand Duchies, especially in Europe, like Luxembourg or Tuscany. Essentially, it was a compromise title, too important to be just a duke, not important enough to be a king. But here's the dirty truth. The Grand and Grand Duke often meant nothing more than clever branding. These rulers inflated their titles to appear more powerful on the global stage. In Russia, Grand Dukes were relatives of the Tsar, which sounds glamorous until you realize many of them were exiled, imprisoned, or forced into silence when palace politics turned sour. The Romanovs. Dozens of Russian Grand Dukes lived in luxury, while peasants starved. When the revolution came in 1917, those same Grand Dukes were stripped of power and cast aside. The title that once promised prestige became a curse, but just beneath them lay a rank everyone knows, one dressed up in fairy tales, yet soaked in betrayal. Rank 5. Prince and Princess. A prince or princess is usually the child of a king or queen, the next in line, or at least part of the royal bloodline. In Latin, princeps meant first citizen or chief, and it was adopted across Europe to mark those closest to the throne. They didn't always rule, but they always carried influence. But here's the lie behind the fairy tale. Being a prince or princess wasn't a life of freedom. It was a cage built from birth. Royal children were raised not as people, but as bargaining chips. Princesses were married off like political currency, and princes spent their lives either plotting for the throne or being quietly erased to protect it. History is full of disappearing princes. The most famous, the Princes in the Tower, Edward V of England and his younger brother, locked away in the Tower of London in 1483 and never seen again. Officially, their uncle Richard III was protecting them. In reality, whispers say he had them quietly removed so he could steal the crown. And if princes lived in cages, dukes lived in shadows, powerful nobles who claimed loyalty, but often dreamed of rebellion. Rank 6. Duke and Duchess. A duke or duchess rules over a duchy, a region granted by the crown. They're the highest rank of nobility below princes, often commanding vast lands and armies. The title comes from the Latin dux, meaning leader, a term once used for Roman generals. But here's the catch. Dukes were supposed to be loyal servants of the crown, yet history shows they were some of the most dangerous rivals kings ever faced. With their own armies and their own wealth, a powerful duke could challenge, or even overthrow, their monarch. Take the Duke of Buckingham, who betrayed King Richard III, or the Duke of Norfolk, who plotted to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, against Elizabeth I's will, and ultimately lost everything. Being a duke wasn't just noble, it was treason waiting to happen. And when dukes played power games, another rank emerged in the middle ground, one that lived on ambition and manipulation. Rank 7. Marquis and Marchioness. A marquis or marchioness was a noble set to guard the marches, the borderlands between kingdoms. Higher than a count, lower than a duke, they were essentially border barons with extra prestige. Their title came from constant warfare on the edges of empires. But here's the dark side. Guarding the border meant marquises often became warlords in their own right. They taxed peasants heavily to fund their private armies, and in times of weak kingship, they acted like independent rulers. In medieval France, certain marquises secretly negotiated with enemy kingdoms, double-crossing their own monarchs. To the king, they were defenders. Behind closed doors, they were opportunists, selling out their own country for survival or profit. And if marquises turned war into profit, counts turned power into corruption, lording over peasants with iron fists. Rank 8. Earl, Count and Countess. An earl in England, or a count-countess in continental Europe, ranked just below marquises. The word earl comes from Old Norse jarl, meaning chieftain, while count comes from the Latin comes, meaning companion to the emperor. These nobles ruled counties, regions of land under the crown. But here's what's buried. Counts and earls were some of the most infamous tyrants of the Middle Ages. With the king far away, they acted like mini-monarchs, squeezing peasants dry with endless taxes. Some even built private castles to resist royal power. Count Dracula himself, Vlad the so-called Impaler, the infamous 15th century ruler of Wallachia, was technically a count. His cruelty became legendary in whispers. Tales say he displayed his enemies to terrify rivals. Centuries later, Bram Stoker turned him into a vampire, but the real horror wasn't the myth, it was the man. And just below them came a rank that lived in constant insecurity. Viscounts, forever overshadowed, forever plotting to climb higher. Rank 9. Viscount and Viscountess. A viscount or viscountess was originally a deputy to a count, the viscount. Over time, it became its own rank, sitting above a baron but below a count. They often handled administration and justice in the count's absence. But here's the ugly truth. Viscounts were notorious for corruption. With power but not prestige, many padded their pockets with bribes, exploited peasants, and schemed constantly to marry into higher ranks. They were seen as ambitious, desperate climbers, and their ambition often turned costly. In 16th century France, the Viscount of Turenne switched sides multiple times during the wars of religion, betraying both Catholics and Protestants whenever it suited him. His betrayals earned him land and wealth, until his story came to a dramatic end. Even below the desperate Viscount, there was one final rung, the barons. Men who may have sat at the bottom, but who sparked some of the biggest revolutions in history. Rank 10. Baron and Baroness. A baron, or baroness, was the lowest rank of the nobility, holding land directly from the king. The word comes from Old French baron, meaning man or warrior. Despite their low status, barons were still above commoners, and that gave them influence. But don't underestimate them. Barons, though small in rank, could unite to topple kings. The most famous example? England's barons forcing King John to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that limited royal power and laid the foundation for modern democracy. Many barons weren't noble heroes. They were opportunists, rebelling not for freedom, but to protect their own wealth from the crown's taxes. In other words, democracy as we know it wasn't born from ideas idealism. It was born from barons protecting their gold. So from emperors who crowned themselves gods to barons who rewrote the rules of power, the royal hierarchy wasn't a ladder of honor. It was a ladder of secrets, lies, and survival. And the higher you climbed, the further you had to fall. Which of these ranks do you think was the most dangerous to hold? The emperor with a target on his back, or the baron who dared to defy kings? If you want to keep uncovering the buried truths that history books try to hide, hit that subscribe button. Not because I told you, but because you know the elites would rather you didn't. And drop your thoughts in the comments. Which rank's hidden scandal shocked you the most? And remember, the past hides more secrets than they want you to know. Until next time, stay tuned, stay safe, and stay informed. Only on Chain of Command.